Great. Thank you so much, Grace. It is so wonderful to see you all. Thank you so much to Population Connection for inviting me to Capitol Hill Days. I've had the opportunity to attend in person in the past, and I loved it, just the energy and the enthusiasm. And so excited to be back today, even though it is through a screen. I know we've all gotten a little more used to it, but it's so wonderful to be here. And also thank you to every single person who showed up and took some time out of your Saturday. Thank you, Karen, for the shout out. I cannot promise that I will be as inspiring as Amanda Gorman, but I will do my best. Certainly gives me a lot of motivation. But thank you all for taking the time today to join me. It's so wonderful to be here. I know we have an hour, so I want to be really mindful of our time. I'm going to share my screen in a moment, kind of walk through just some of the core best practices when we think about storytelling, sharing your story, and how that can be a really effective tool for organizing and movement building and getting people to care and connect to issues and causes. And then we really want to take some time to actually practice sharing our stories with each other. So the last half of today's workshop, we're going to be kind of just connecting in breakout sessions where folks can share your story, talk about why you care about this issue, and use that as a space to maybe think about your lobbying sessions for Monday and how you want to practice for that, for other conversations you might want to have with friends or people in your community to talk about these issues that you've been learning over the last few days. So we're going to make this interactive. I'm standing up at home, so if you need to stand up and stretch, do it, go for it. If at any point you need to turn off your camera, that's fine too. There will be opportunities for questions as well before we shift gears to breakout sessions. So feel free to drop those questions in the chat, and some of my friends at the Population Connection team are going to make sure that we're capturing those. And I'll do my best to get to as many of those as possible, but I love your questions, so please feel free to ask them. But with that, let's jump right in. I'm going to share my screen. All right, so we're starting with perhaps one of the most iconic storytellers, LeVar Burton. Some might say the true Jeopardy host that is needed in our lives right now. But it is with his inspiration and the inspiration of my background that I'm hoping to kind of channel when we talk about stories and why they're so important and critical, not only to how we connect as humans, but how we engage people around issues and causes, and how our collective story sharing can really help to change policies and to change the world. Stories obviously are something that it's very true and dear to my heart as a communicator. This is a photo of a few years ago. This is a young Tanya in college coming to Washington, D.C. For a conference and event very similar to Capitol Hill Days. I was a college student in South Carolina. I found my community of kind of like-minded feminist activists. We learned about this opportunity to come to DC to learn and discuss issues that are impacting women and girls. And then it ended with an event to go to the Hill and talk to our lawmakers. And so this is us at this conference just a day or two before we would head to DC for the first time. I had never been to DC before. And one of the things that we were passionate about in a state like South Carolina in particular was access to birth control, access and education. And so many of us had our own personal stories about the power and the impact of that. But we always brought this one story that one of our colleagues had heard from working at a nearby healthcare clinic. And it was one of those things that it was almost too insane to be true, but I promise you it was. And it's very much a product of kind of the challenges that so many young people in South Carolina at the time were really facing by not having access and education to birth control. And so one of the stories that we would share when we would go on the Hill and we're meeting with lawmakers and their staff, again, mostly folks who were not particularly receptive to our issue areas and our asks for asking for more funding and access to education and birth control on our college campuses and in our communities. We told this story of this young woman who'd come to a healthcare clinic and she had been pregnant. And as the provider was kind of talking to her and understanding a little bit about her situation, one of the things that she had shared was that she had been using birth control and she had been using spermicidal jelly. and she had been putting it on toast and eating it. And she thought that it was a jelly that should have been eaten. And every time we would tell this story, jaws would just drop, right? It was one of those things that, like, you've got to be kidding me. And it was unfortunately very, very true. And again, it was so indicative of the lack of education and access to birth control in that state. And then the consequences that happen. You had this young woman who found herself pregnant, and she didn't intend to be pregnant. And so it was one of those stories that we would deliver to lawmaker after lawmaker. And it always got kind of a similar reaction of just pure astonishment. And while it didn't necessarily move the needle, and suddenly we got, congressmen like Joe Wilson, for example, to be a champion for birth control, it was a story that stayed with them, right? And that's what stories can do. They can communicate in such a powerful way, in a way that sometimes data or wonky policy research can't. It's a story that certainly has stayed with me these many years later. And it's one that, when we think about the work that the Population Connection is working on, and what you all are hoping to talk to policymakers about, not only on Monday, but in the weeks and months to come, where you're talking about to people in your community or advocates or colleagues, thinking about how you can find your own voice, your own powerful story, even if it's not going to be a head scratcher like the spermicidal jelly story. Each of us has a story to tell. I want to start this with a brief pop quiz. Don't worry, no one's going to be graded. You don't have to come off mute to answer this question. But I want to ask you all to just take a second, try to match some of these statistics with these issues. You got U.S. abortion restrictions last year, world population, the percentage of women in Congress, COVID deaths worldwide, and kids killed by gun violence each day. If you had to take a moment, how many of these do you think you could correctly match? If you're like me, this might be challenging, right? For some of you, particularly folks who work at Population Connection, there might be one on here that is pretty easy to match around world population, but others may be a little bit more difficult. Now, if you think about the people and issues, so not data points, try matching a person to some of these issues. Hate crimes, girls' education, sexual assault, Black Lives Matter, and the March for Our Lives. I'd venture to guess that probably this was a little bit easier, right? When you think about the testimony of Christine Blasey Ford, for example, a few years ago, you may not know that 1 in 6 women may experience sexual violence, right? But you know her story, you know her testimony that was powerful, that maybe resonated with you, whether you are a survivor of sexual violence or know someone, or just simply understood the unique challenges of being a young woman at that time in those environments, and the shame and stigma that can come from experiencing trauma and pain. Unfortunately, one of the things when I was thinking about looking at this list is how common pain and trauma is in so many of these stories, and so many of these stories that build movements. It's probably a workshop for a different day, but I'd love to explore how we can lift up stories that don't have to be deeply rooted on pain and trauma, and particularly trauma of Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. But unfortunately, these are stories, right? The stories of Breonna Taylor, Emma Gonzalez, Malala, Matthew Shepard, Christine Blasey Ford, and so many others that allow us to understand and connect to issues. Those are the stories that we share with our colleagues and our friends. And they're the stories that really mobilize movements. And so that is the power of storytelling, right? You may not recall what some of those data points in the previous slide were, right? But you will remember these stories, and you'll remember them, how they made you feel and how you were inspired to act. So when you're thinking about sharing your story, sharing your voice, while they don't have to be necessarily stories that are leading hundreds of thousands of people to march or inspiring global movements, one-on-one, each person that you're connecting by authentically sharing your story can have an impact in deepening someone's understanding of an issue, and again, mobilizing them to join you. So why does storytelling matter? Why are we here? Why are we spending time on our Saturdays to talk about this? Stories are incredibly important and effective when we think about advocacy and how people relate to issues and relate to the world. Stories are universal, right? They really allow us to relate and connect to each other. From early childhood, we are told stories. When we travel the world, we understand and connect to new places, new cultures through storytelling. And they can be that bridge that can overcome divides, be it cultural, linguistic, generational. Stories can allow us to connect across faith, political party, and ideology. When we share stories, we see ourselves in other people and in other communities. Stories also have a very practical ability to just simply allow us to process information. Our brains are wired for narrative structures, wired for stories. It's how we understand something. It's how we understand something that's happened to us. There's a story coming out of Capitol Hill days, right? When you will talk to a colleague or a friend or a family member about these last few days, you'll be telling a story. And so while you may forget certain details or data points around an issue or even about this weekend, you'll remember this collective story, the stories that you heard, stories from people like Melvine, who's here with us today, and her story and the incredible work of so many people in her community in Kenya. And that will inspire people to act. Stories also help to shape our identities. There's a story that we tell about ourselves that brought us here on a Saturday, right? And so how we define ourselves, how we see ourselves in relation to others and in the world, how we understand issues is so informed and deeply informed by storytelling. And then, of course, stories have a connective tissue. They allow us to make connections by tapping into deep, powerful emotions. And as I said, sometimes, unfortunately, those emotions can be rooted in pain and trauma. But that can allow us to have a connection and bind us to other people, to causes, to places. They have an imprint, stories do. When we think about those powerful stories, there are some things that many powerful stories tend to have in common that kind of stick with you. Again, data, you may remember it, you may not, but a story has that lasting staying power. And some of the key qualities here, when we think about powerful stories, start with those stories that are deeply personal, right? They are stories that impacted and affected someone's life. Stories that are relatable, right? Even if you maybe, haven't been to some of the countries that have been impacted by a policy like the global gag rule, for example, maybe you have experienced what it's like to be nervous about not having health insurance and not knowing whether or not you can go to the doctor to get the care that you need, or you are a parent, or you've taken care of a loved one, or you've seen someone who's had to struggle with thinking about whether or not that they can make the healthcare decisions that are best for them without the influence of governments or others, right? There's an ability to kind of see ourselves in other stories, even if those experiences are vastly different from maybe the experience that by and large we've had. Stories can also be incredibly powerful when they are surprising, when they make you kind of tilt your head a little bit and catch you off guard, when they tell something or reveal something that you may not expect. And this issue may be common when you think about the impact of these policies when they've been in place. Like, so the global gag rule, for example, being a policy that when it's been in place under previous administrations has actually had an increase in the abortion rate. When we think about this issue in general, we think about sexual and reproductive health. There's a lot of assumptions that people make in terms of your political ideology, your faith, right? And so if you are someone that can say, actually, as someone of deep faith, right, as someone who grew up in a conservative home in rural America, right, like these are issues that I am deeply connected about and to, and here's why. That can be surprising for people. Powerful stories also can feel deeply relevant. They can feel like they're adding to a conversation or provide context to something that's going on in our communities, that's happening in Capitol Hill or happening around the world. And then they can also be timely, right? There's a sense of urgency. And so when I'm sharing this story, I'm also creating an opportunity for you to do something about it right now that would have an impact. Those are some of the key elements that are powerful about storytelling. And the other thing that I'd add that I think is so critical when we think about storytelling for advocacy purposes is authenticity and being an authentic storyteller. If you come away from this session hearing nothing else, learning nothing else, it is to be authentic. Whatever it is that brought you here today, that made you care about this issue, that wanted to be a part of Capitol Hill Days and to share your voice, follow that passion. This is not about memorizing talking points or a fact sheet or sounding exactly like someone else sounds. Because if everybody sounded the same, right, we would limit our ability to reach other people. So speak your truth, speak in a way that feels real and authentic to you, and that is what will connect and resonate with people. Authenticity in storytelling is so, so important. So when you think about how to effectively tell your story, there's a few key things to kind of keep in mind. As we talked about with some of the kind of key elements, making it personal is really, really important. So as we head into our breakout sessions, and when you think about the storytelling conversations you want to have and how you want to share your story, think about some of these questions. So you can feel free to reflect on these now and maybe make some notes for yourself before we head into the breakout session. So what is personal about this issue, right? Why do you care about it? How has it impacted your life or perhaps the lives of people that you care about? How does it make you feel, right? Are you deeply concerned about the impact of population on the environment and on our climate? Are you saddened or enraged by the idea of the impacts on free speech? Do you care about this issue because you have had an abortion and you believe that it is something that no government should have a role in influencing whether or not you have information or access to that care? Whatever the issue may be, right? Think about why this is something that is personal for you and start there. It doesn't have to be something that, again, is kind of closely aligned to the communities that are impacted by these policies. Find the things that resonate for you, and those will be things that will be effective in communicating with others. In addition to making it personal, also think about the audience that you're speaking to and how to kind of relate and connect to people. And when you're talking to some lawmakers on Monday, you might be speaking to people who are strong champions of these issues. I hope you are. But it's also likely and important that you're also talking to people who may not necessarily be on board or deeply supportive of these issues. And when you're talking to people who are not going to be likely inclined or eager to engage with this issue, what's incredibly important is to kind of find that common ground and where you can bridge and connect with them. So what are some of the common experiences or concerns that you might have? Where is it that you can agree on? Why should this issue be something that they care about? How does it impact them? And for some people, it might be an issue around tax dollars, right? And being efficient with our aid and our resources and making sure that we are investing in something that is going to save lives, like international family planning. For other people, it might be the health and well-being of communities. If you know that, for example, one of the lawmakers you're speaking to has been a supportive of the Violence Against Women Act, for example, right? Like, I know that you've supported the reauthorization of VAWA, and you can talk about violence against women and the need to ensure that women and girls and communities are safe and have access to care that they need, right? You can kind of find those common threads. If you are in your community or on a college campus, there may be ways to connect people across faith, for example, or similar communities that you grew up in. I remember when I was starting out and doing a lot of grassroots organizing, on our campus, we would go to sororities and we would go to where the sports teams were, right? And we would talk to them about this issue, but in a very different way, because we would identify what it is that we thought that they could understand or how they could relate to this issue to get them on board to be more supportive, for example, of having better access to birth control in our college campus. So connecting and thinking about your audience and doing a little bit of homework is also important. Now, I don't want people to think that when we think about the value and the effectiveness of storytelling, that means that we are anti-data. That is not true at all. Data can be really, really effective, but using it in a smart and strategic way is also really important, because too many numbers, eventually none of them will stick, right? So really thinking about what is maybe the 1 or 2 data points that really can help back up and validate your point of view, right? Is there a data point that might be surprising? Like I mentioned earlier, the fact that under George W. Bush, when the global gag rule was in place, those countries that were most impacted by that policy saw a 40% increase in abortion rates, right? That will be surprising to people who are saying, no, I support this policy because I want to see fewer abortions, right? Is there inaccurate information or misinformation where a data point could be really helpful in correcting that narrative? So again, thinking about when and how to deploy data is really, really valuable when you're telling your story as well. You also want to think about making sure that people understand what it is that you want to communicate to them, and being clear and concise when you're doing that. You know, when someone has heard your story, you want to make sure is that they know what to do with that information, right? You've talked to them about, you know, why this issue is deeply impersonal. You've made the kind of emotional appeal and connected to something that we think that would be a shared kind of common value or experience or concern. But what do you want them to do with all that information? You've brought them along. What is the action that you want them to take? Do you want them to, if you're a lawmaker, be a stronger champion for this issue, or co-sponsor pieces of legislation, or advocate for more funding? If it's somebody in your community, do you want them to become a part of this campaign, sign this petition, you know, retweet this video that just came out? Whatever the case may be, making sure that you're bringing someone along in that storytelling journey, that you don't leave them hanging, right? So what do you want them to do now that they've been informed and empowered by your story? And then also to do it in a way that is clear and concise and getting to the point. So often when we think about our own stories, particularly ones that are deeply personal, we can become a little long-winded, and we could go off into some tangents and maybe get into some details that, while can be important, maybe muddy the waters a little bit. And so thinking about how can I edit and pare down my story in a way that is going to most effectively and clearly communicate what it is that I want people to know. And we can talk in a moment about different formats and when you can have a little bit more time to get a little bit more into the details. So when you think about your story here, you can think about it almost as sort of like an elevator pitch, right? So much of your storytelling is also influenced in not just who you're speaking to, but how much time you have to speak, right? So for example, we have an hour today. I know we want to have a good chunk of this session for breakout sessions. So I have about 20-25 minutes to talk to you about storytelling. If given the opportunity, I could also do a 2-hour version of storytelling. So when I think about how much time I have to adjust what it is that I want to communicate, right? And so if you're thinking about an elevator, how much time you have to communicate your story or why someone should care about this issue is also important. And again, it makes sure that you're really being effective when you are engaging someone. So if you're thinking about, I just got 20 seconds, I've got one floor here, really think about your powerful one-liner, your statement, maybe your mic drop comment, right? It's going to clearly articulate your point of view. So for example, I support family planning because the government should have no more control over my body than I do, right? Maybe that resonates with you. Maybe there's something else that you'd want to say. What is sort of your kind of thesis statement, if you will, about why you care about this issue? If you only could say one thing, what would it be? If you have a little bit more time, 3 to 5 floors, right? Think about how you could build on that by giving something that someone could do, right? Offering a clear call to action. So you could expand on that by talking about a policy solution, for example. So the Global HER Act would permanently repeal a Reagan-era policy that denies U.S. foreign aid to healthcare clinics that provide, refer, or even talk about abortion services. Congress must pass this bill now. You've got a little bit more time. You've got 10 floors maybe to talk to someone. So you can think about, all right, I have 2 or 3 minutes here maybe is generous, depends on how fast the elevator is. But you can, again, continue to build on your own story, that call to action, by adding in an emotional appeal, right? This policy is not only outdated, it's deadly, right? What are the impacts? Lack of access to family planning increases the risk maternal and infant mortality, it's clear that family planning saves lives. You're packing that emotional punch that, again, really, really connects and resonates with people. And then if you've got a few minutes, you're going all the way to the rooftop, you can then, again, really get into your own detailed story and support that conversation with data points. So that's where you can think about pulling up something about the investment in international family planning and the positive impacts that come from that. So you could say something, every $10 million that's invested in international family planning results in 200,000 fewer unintended pregnancies and 320 fewer maternal deaths. So again, depending on how much time you have, you can tailor and shape the conversation that you can have. In journalism, we think about this as sort of the inverted pyramid, right? So when you think about most news stories that you read, the first paragraph should be the most critical information. This was an approach that was largely devised by how people would communicate when we had the telegraph, that if we only have just one line to get across, it's not going to be, I got something really important to tell you, send, right? Like, I need you to know what it is that is most important. So you want to lead with that information. And then as you have more time, and as you're maybe continuing to tell your story or reading an article, that's when you can get into other valuable but more supplemental information. So when we think about storytelling and how it helps us to build our power as organizers, there's a few different venues that you can do this, right? Many of you are going to be participating on Monday in the lobby day, talking to policymakers. Some folks maybe have already been really engaged in the Fight for Her campaign and are engaged on social media, and you're talking to the people and recruiting them. Maybe you've even had the opportunity to talk to press. Maybe you've done interviews or you've written an op-ed or LTE, really thinking about where to meet people where they're at and helping to kind of mobilize people around this issue through storytelling. So if you want to start, for example, by thinking about how you can recruit activists and supporters in person, maybe going back into your community or your college campus or into your church, wherever the case may be, thinking about, again, starting with how do you make that connection and how can you be relatable by identifying and understanding what it is that they care about. And one of the best ways to do that is to listen. I think some of the best storytellers are, in fact, the best listeners. When you're talking to someone, again, being mindful of how much time you have, sharing your story, thinking about more of a short story than a novel, right? When we think about some of the opportunities with press and maybe an op-ed, that's when you've got a little bit more time. You can go a little bit more into your story, but really thinking about getting to the point. And then when you're connecting with them, make it really easy to talk about how they can become involved, right? So maybe you're seeing somebody in your community and you notice a button maybe that they have on their bag, right? And you want to talk to them about that issue. And it looks like that you care about, women's rights. I'm also pro-choice. Do you know about the global gag rule? I just came, back from this conference with Population Connection. I learned about this issue. Here's why it's important to me. There's actually a petition you can sign. Let me give you that website, right? A short, brief conversation of how you can recruit people into this issue. Now, if you're on social media, obviously there's incredible ways to engage in vibrant communities around this work and communities across the world, right? People who are impacted by these policies, people who are here in the United States who are lobbying our lawmakers to do better and to fund international family planning services. Finding those people, organizations like Population Connection, some of the speakers you've heard at Capitol Hill Days, the hashtags that are being used around these issues, get involved in those communities and conversations and start to share your own story, right? Contribute to that conversation. Think about, graphics that you want to share and put out there or retweet from other organizations, a video that you want to record. I love PopCon's TikToks, for example, right? Like if you're somebody who's savvy, go for it, right? Think about the different ways that you can be a part of those conversations. One disclaimer with anything online, of course, is to be aware of kind of the harassment and the trolls that can come with people engaging on this issue in particular. And I think it's something that, particularly around this issue and for women who are engaging this issue, is really, really important. So I just wanted to put a caveat on that, especially if you're sharing deeply personal information about this issue. Now, with policymakers, I won't steal the thunder from Stacy when I'm sure she's going to be giving a great presentation about how to effectively lobby. But again, know that you won't have a lot of time. Have a game plan if you're going with other people, what it is that you want to say, who's saying what, know their record, do that research ahead of time. I'm sure the population connection team is going to be preparing you with that and making sure you have a clear ask. So I'm here because I want you to know this and I want you to do this, right? And don't worry about covering all the bases. That's where those leave behind materials are really valuable. And if you're talking to a reporter, really thinking about, what it is that they want to discuss, make sure you know those questions. How much time do you have to talk to them? Is it a 10-minute phone interview? Is it, quick 2 minutes after a rally that you were just at? What is it that you want to say? What are my 2 or 3 main messages? Let that guide you. If you've got a question you don't know the answer to, never lie. Say, let me get back to you. Let me find out some information. I know there's somebody at Population Connection who's probably better able to speak to that, whatever the case may be. And then if you want to think about how to have more time, maybe a little bit more control in sharing your story, that's where writing an op-ed, an opinion piece, it's like maybe 700, 800 words to your local paper, or a letter to the editor that's maybe 200 words in response to an article or to talk about your meeting with your lawmaker, is a great way to share your story. And again, to include a clear ask for what it is that you want people to know. This is just an example, just something that I just worked up just to kind of see what this could look like in practice, right? So let's say you were thinking about how to recruit someone to this issue and you wanted to share why you first cared about it, right? You want to make it personal. Social worker, I've seen this firsthand. I know what it's like when you don't have access to these resources and how important healthcare is, right? It's a fundamental right that literally tells people that they matter, that you care about their health. And as a woman, right, I can't imagine what it would be like to go into a doctor's office and not have all the actual information and access to care that I would need. Can you, right? That's a way of connecting, perhaps if you're speaking to another woman or speaking to somebody who's also maybe in the social work field. And then you want to pivot and you want to talk about, again, what is your ask and the impact of this policy? So that's where you could talk about the global gag rule, right? And the fact that it's forcing people to stay quiet about abortion, forcing these foreign healthcare providers to not talk about it, even if they have their own money, right? And when you don't have access to this information and to this care, it has an impact on not just that individual, but entire communities. And again, that's where you see the negative health outcomes in terms of unintended pregnancies and maternal mortality. And then that's where you kind of state your claim. So that's why I support eliminating these restrictions, right, on US foreign aid. Family planning saves lives and must be as accessible as possible. The Global HER Act will make sure that no president can do this unilaterally. Will you sign this petition and tell Congress to pass the Global HER Act, right? Again, this isn't perfect. It's not talking points. It's not perfectly polished. Thinking about how to put it into your own words is really, really important when you think about that authenticity. But much of the story that you want to tell should have some of these key elements. I want to pause really briefly because I know we want to get to our breakout sessions just to see if we have any initial questions. And folks can either drop them into the chat or come off mute. I think maybe we have time for maybe like 1 or 2 questions. Okay, I want to keep going because I want to make sure that we do have good time in our breakout sessions, but if we have time at the end, feel free to come back and we can talk more about questions. All right, so breakout sessions. This is what we're going to do now. So we've got about, let's say, 15 minutes. I probably went too long. What I want you all to do is we're going to go out into breakout rooms, choose a scenario, talk about either practice recruiting someone, similar maybe to the example that I just shared, or how to lobby a policymaker. And then again, think about how to make it personal. Why do you care about this issue? Has it impacted your life or the lives of others? How does it make you feel? Connect to that person. So if you coming up with a scenario of recruiting somebody or a lawmaker, think about maybe their experiences or opinions on this issue. What can you maybe agree on and find some common ground? How do you connect to that? And then make sure when you're doing it, you give somebody something to do, right? Join this campaign, support the passage of the Global HER Act, and get rid of the global gag rule. One thing I just wanted to note at the bottom here is a few resources from the networking session the other day. There's a great conversation about maybe things to not say or messaging. Population Connection, I know, has a wealth of great resources on their website, but some additional things to consider. Physicians for Reproductive Health PRH.org has a reporter resource. So there's a link that I can put into the chat. And then also there's another great resource from Progressive Playbook. And they talk about a whole host of social issues, but including reproductive health, and you can find some really helpful messaging guides there. So if you're thinking about language when you're doing your storytelling, you might want to check out some of them.